The title of this video could honestly be applied to a couple of the flagships, as well as other monsters within Monster Hunter. However, I thought I'd focus it on a monster that I feel has the potential to be so much more, with some of the coolest gear, abilities and fights in Monster Hunter history. Let's talk about why Seregios has been underutilized within the series. For the people who surprisingly don't know and yet clicked on this video, Seregios is a flying wyvern introduced as a flagship of Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate. It's covered in incredibly sharp blade scales that it can detach and fire at enemies, as well as zygodactyl feet used for sweeping kicks. They're usually referred to as the 1000 Blade Wyvern or Slicing Scales, but most of the fanbase call it Steve. I personally love Steve and will probably use it interchangeably with Seregios, but I'd be interested in knowing other nicknames down below. Another cool thing to note is, unless someone in the comments knows of another example, I believe Seregios is the only monster where an official representative of Capcom has given a nickname jokingly and then it's sticking, which I think is pretty cool too. Oh, and please remember to subscribe, that would be cool too. Anyway, back to some more general information. Seregios is also known as the father of bleed, being the first monster to utilize this new ailment. Many of Steve's attacks are able to inflict bleed, and most commonly they tend to be the ones where the blade scales are involved. The bleed ailment causes gradual ticking damage in the 4th gen games, as well as in Worldborn, and crouching or eating a consumable like well done steak will cure it. In Sunbreak, bleed was altered to fill up a gauge that increased the damage from the next subsequent hit. Interestingly, Seregios is also only one of 8 monsters that utilize bleed in the mainline series, with the other only proper fully bleed-focused contenders being Odogaron and Ruina Nergigante. In terms of design, Steve was created to serve as a rival to the king and queen of Monster Hunter, the Wraths. Attacking both in multiple cutscenes and ecology videos, even the localization team was told Rathalos' rival as one of the few specific words given to create its name. It also follows the, still relatively new at the time, pattern of giving monsters much more impressive shifts in design when enraged, such as Gormagala, Zinogre or Mizutsune. Seeing Steve's scales stand up on end and suddenly scream and screech while swooping down in Monster Hunter 4U was certainly an experience. Speaking of 4U, being the game that introduced Seregios, there was a lot of focus given to Steve as per usual with flagships. It's got really good equipment for getting through a chunk of both village and G-rank quests and a stellar high-paced fight, avoiding the pins and bleed. However, it's how Steve is utilised within this game that issues can already be seen. After the stellar story, for Monster Hunter, focusing on the caravan crew chasing and slaying the Mhgalas, your hunter is able to relax for about 5 seconds before a massive Seregios flock appears. These were driven up by an apex Seregios, and they appear in multiple biomes and in most quests from this moment on. This eventually concludes with a dramatic showdown in the Everwood before you successfully slay the apex Seregios. And unfortunately, this story just doesn't hold a candle to the Mhgala plot. While I do still enjoy the plot of taking down the apex Seregios, it just feels a little tagged on, and the final conclusion was mostly just in one zone constantly mounting, with the only stress being the Y-stone usage. That's not to say the fight isn't good, as I always enjoy a duel with Steve, but unfortunately, as is the nature of Monster Hunter, the more you hunt, the easier its tells become, and just judging by my YouTube icon, I have already hunted a fair amount of Seregios. It's at this point where already, being the flagship of the entire game, Steve is almost forgotten other than its brief story arc and usefulness as equipment in G-Rank 2. Seregios doesn't change much in Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate, or in Generations for that matter. However, it does appear in new locales which can change up the pace slightly if you're unfamiliar with the area. I will say I think Steve did get more use in its equipment, as I personally used its greatsword for the entirety of low and high rank as soon as I could make it. The only downside is, like Lagiakrith that was unfortunately gutted in Generations, Steve received no deviant form, which I feel could have made him a formidable foe, almost on par with something like Bloodbath. That combined with hunter arts and styles meant that the fight was far easier compared to 4U, and meant Steve was a breeze, and farming his gear was just as simple. Seregios gear is very special. For Blade Master weapons, although they tend to not have the best sharpness, they make up for it by having the special ability where if you roll it restores some sharpness. For gunner weapons it reloads a single bullet with a roll, and for the bow it gives a boost to close range coatings. This theoretically means that when using Steve's weapon, there is no need for whetstones or to manually reload. I will admit that I am not a bow player, having only dabbled with it in Sunbreak. If I'm wrong about this, please feel free to correct me, but I believe it's one of the best bows in 4U in terms of damage, but only for raw build. Each weapon having a unique attribute like this is incredible, and it carries over to G and GU. The armour on the other hand is also a decent set. As I said, it's a very good set for G2 quests and 4U, and you can definitely play around with it in the games it appears in. But losing Steady Hand really made it lose viability. It usually has quite good defense, with skills relating to, who could have guessed, sharpness. Aesthetically, Steve's equipment is fantastic in my opinion. Of course it's subjective, but the sharp edges mixed with the gold scales really gives you the feeling that these weapons can do some serious damage, with an armour set that really sells the Gladiator look way before Giratodas came about. Except for the female Blademaster set, I don't really know why that one looks a bit shit. And here we come to the current iteration of Steve. Sunbreak made me incredibly excited to face against this bleeding monstrosity. With monsters needing to be speedy and deadly to deal with the hunter's new moves, it would make Seregios a crazy fight, and the fact that it would return with all its gear and mechanics made me hyped. Then, me and my friends beat its key quest in like 10 minutes, realised we had lost its unique weapon gimmick, and the armour was meh. So yeah, unfortunately I would say that while Steve itself is great in a vacuum, for Sunbreak it unfortunately crashes and burns as a whole. The fact that afflicted Seregios gives me less trouble than a regular seething basil juice is not a good thing. It's really a shame as it's gotten some really stellar improvements to its moveset, with new pins, a new theme, combos and more. But because the hunter is just so powerful, I'm afraid Steve just didn't have the impact he could have had for new players. Plus, to add insult to injury, Chaotic Gore got its weapon gimmicks but not Steve. Seregios at the moment is at a weird spot. It's a fantastic monster with brilliant ecology, design, theme, gimmick, moveset and aesthetic. But it just lacks behind at the moment. There's a reason more people tend to love Astalos, even though it's the same rank as Steve. I think the one way Steve can manage to fly out from the shadow cast by other flying wyverns is to have its gimmick properly restored, with a steady hand making a return. Sure, it could be seen as busted, but considering we have sets that seem to almost defy what's possible, I don't think it's a big deal. Another way is to make a new version of Steve. The Apex Seregios was one thing, but personally a deviant or variant would make Steve truly shine. And no, I don't mean just adding an element or changing the ailment, because that would just make it Astalos or Basil Juice or Legiacris but on the sky. Or even Aurora Somnicanth. Just a crazy fast, crazy strong Seregios in a vein similar to Ruin and Nergigante, with harder scales and more of them. This would at least push Steve to the forefront of players' minds as a suitable endgame challenge, making it actually stand toe-to-toe with the other flagships in this series. In conclusion, I don't think that much needs to be done to fix the neglect Seregios seems to get, and with a few tweaks here and there, I'm sure in future titles I'll see my wish fulfilled. Thanks for watching. I'm sure this was either a painful or enjoyable experience considering this is the first large video I've ever made, but I hope I could bring some awareness to this topic. Feel free to let me know what you think of Seregios, as well as letting me know what I could improve for future videos. Stay safe and have a good one.